Hello again, and good afternoon this time. I guess the world changes around here while I'm doing this stuff. So, in this particular presentation, I'm going to be talking about ways in which training can be delivered and how to evaluate that training. We can talk about training delivery in multiple ways. We can talk general approaches to training, like methodology by which it is presented, and then we can talk employee-based approaches, development approaches, things that you can do to improve your employees. The original, or is a lecture, right? It's a good old-fashioned lecture. Is the original form of training. It's good for teaching facts, but since generally speaking lectures don't involve anything hands-on, sometimes there are certain things that can't be taught in a lecture. But lectures are usually effective and relatively cheap. So lectures continue to be used in a lot of different sources. On-the-job training is actually a pretty popular, the most popular, which is basically just throw them into the job and watch what happens. And so what basically the idea is that we believe that this new employee can benefit from watching current employees, talking with them, working with them with actual materials. The problem is that the success of such a technique really is dependent upon the trainer, the one that is doing the training. And I don't know about you, but in the world I came from, whenever I had to be trained in a new job, of course these were, high school jobs and stuff. Who did the training was whoever was available at the moment, okay? And so all of a sudden, it may be another 17-year-old kid training another 16-year-old kid. And that may not be the most effective way to do it. More self-directed techniques it would be like trainees go at their own pace, programmed instruction, so material is presented as units or something like that. Um, in fact, the city training, the online ethical training program that I've offered, provided as an extra credit opportunity, is broken down like this. It's programmed that material is broken into small units or modules or whatever it is they're going to call it in there. Then you take a test, and then you're given feedback on each module. It depends on the learner. Sometimes effective, sometimes not. Virtual reality training is obviously a somewhat newer technique in which you design a simulation to match, remember the identical elements theory of transfer, so you design a virtual reality setting which is as similar as possible to the real thing. Now, virtual reality training is obviously a fairly expensive thing to do, but in certain situations where equipment is too dangerous or something or too expensive, so pilots using virtual reality training or astronauts or something, it's very sensible. Even though it's relatively expensive to set up, it is less costly than putting people that don't know what they're doing in charge of a rocket. Woo, possible problems there. Okay, and so the effectiveness of these virtual reality training simulators is basically a function of physical and psychological fidelity. In physical fidelity, the extent to which the operation mimics the real world. So the physical things you have to do. And the psychological fidelity is to the extent to which the behavioral processes for success on the job are also required for success in the simulator. E-learning or web-based learning. Training developed via the internet. Obviously, this has got some advantages because the employees can be in a remote site. They don't have to be physically present. The learners have some control. They can, you can create discussion groups in these kinds of environments, which some people find beneficial. It's relatively quick to update and change information. It may or may not be more effective than classroom-based training. I think in a lot of ways it's a product of the trainee themselves. Some trainees respond better to different types. So technology-based approaches to training are the thing. I mean, this is just the way it is coming. Combining e-learning with traditional classroom learning. This is the way not just IO psychology training is working, but how university classes are coming. you are sitting in a technology-based training situation, right? I mean, that's what you're doing right now. And we can blend these things. They call it blended learning. In academia, we call it the blended classroom. Maybe some of you have taken hybrid courses with me. And in the hybrid courses, the students do the majority of the learning using web-based materials at home, and then in the classroom, we do more discussion-oriented topics to facilitate critical thinking skills. So it's an interesting way to blend together the best of both worlds. Well, when workers come in for orientation, okay, they need to learn lots of things at orientation. Sometimes it's specific job skills, how do you use this particular machine or something. But sometimes orientation training requires organizational socialization. Here is what our organization has, our organizational culture looks like. Maybe we do things this way, or we don't like new ideas, or heck, don't piss off this manager because he has a short fuse, or he or she, right? He or she. So we find that organizational socialization is going to become more and more complex now with more globally based corporations. Coaching. This particular information on coaching would be relevant whether we were talking, what was it last time, a baseball player or a new employee. Okay, the coach, the coach's job, as I said in baseball, the coach's job is to look at, let's say, the position in which a player is standing when they go up to the bat, and to tell them which ways they could improve and change the positioning to perform better. Well, it's the same type of thing with coaching, where supervisors look at the subordinates and say, what is your current, what are you doing currently? What can we do to improve it? So hopefully it'll improve communication, collaboration, but it's coaching is good for both short-term success as far as like, job performance, but coaching is also useful for long-term career planning. Coaching, executive coaching is slightly different. Usually coaching is a manager or supervisor that goes to an individual employee. And clearly in those cases, what you find is that the goal of the manager is to, increase job performance. But what if the managers need coaching? So usually if you get people on the higher end that need coaching, you have to outsource for it. You have to find an external consultant to come in to work with mid or high level executives. And so clearly what is being coached is something radically different than when you're talking an assembly line kind of worker. And so what we find is that executive coaching is good for effectively changing managerial behaviors like goal setting, feedback giving, amount managers ask for input, whatever. Okay, that's cool. Behavioral modeling, and again, this is based on what's his name, Bandura, Albert Bandura. And if you recall Bandura and his Bobodal studying, the premise is that most things that we learn are learned through observations. Okay, much of what we learn, and I mean, you sit through a learning class, and I'll tell you, by far the majority of the information that's in your head, you have learned by watching another person. Okay, that's just the way it works. And so what will often happen is that an exemplary model will be presented, and the employee will be said, I want you to imitate or mimic this particular. And so it has uses especially for interpersonal skills. Business simulations are management games, and again, this is probably higher level positions, managing positions rather than individual employees. Wow, I'm seeing things out my window that'll freak you out. I see two squirrels doing something that. All right, never mind. I'll pretend I didn't see that. Okay, managers are presented with managerial decisions, and so the games move on so that the result of the decision they make early in the games affects how the game continues. Now, trainees take and say, these are great, they're interesting, they're relevant, they're realistic. But what happens is often the people involved get so caught up in the competitive nature of the training scenario that they forget the point, right? Why am I here? Corporate universities is an interesting trend. Now, look at that, 1,800 corporate universities. So clearly, McDonald's Hamburger University is the most famous. But the idea is that, of course, training and training facilities cost a lot of money. And if you try to implement training facilities at each and every location, all right, and so these companies like Caterpillar, Caterpillar, they make the big trucks for construction. Caterpillar will have factories in 20 different places in the country. Obviously McDonald's is in 20 different places. And so what happens is that you can spend an incredibly amount of money, but put it in one location and bring workers there. And that way you could greatly reduce training costs by having one state-of-the-art facility that costs bunches of money, but all the people from all over your company can come there. Okay, McDonald University. I would have to say I just said that. Sexual harassment training. Yeah, sexual harassment in the workplace, and we talked about the two different kinds, quid pro quo and hostile work environment. That's right, remember. And so clearly sexual harassment in the workforce has consequences. It clearly affects relationships in the work. It affects career directions for those involved. It can reduce self-esteem, increase ulcers, even physical problems, but it can increase tardiness and absenteeism. So this sexual harassment, whether it be quid pro quo or a hostile work environment, clearly has consequences in lots of dimensions. So sexual harassment training has in fact become relatively popular. And again, not because I need it, okay, don't get, but yeah, the university has in fact mandated that all employees will take sexual harassment training, and it's a requirement. I don't know if it's a federal requirement or what, but I had to do it a couple of 6 months ago or something. And so, yeah, it involved videos, and it showed these are acceptable, these are unacceptable, and this is what you do. And then at the end, I had to take some quizzes, and it was silly. I'm not saying the sexual harassment isn't important, or sexual harassment training. Hey, be careful, I didn't say that. And not that this is not important, but unfortunately, the training, at least that I went through, was designed in such a way that it just wasn't presented in a serious fashion. How about that? Yeah, it just wasn't well done. But anyway, the problem is that behavioral modeling sensitizes. So if you have a few employees that are in fact engaging in sexual harassment, other employees will become desensitized to it, and they will just sort of copy them or something. And so we find, though, males and females view these behaviors as quite different, okay? And the exact same behavior by a male and a female, males might see something as a joke, women might see it as sexual harassment, okay? So we need to train, especially the males, that there is a difference in how gender perceptions of behaviors. Diversity training is also important, and we've already talked about diversity, and especially when we talked about like the University of Michigan cases. And if you recall, if the selection procedure used diversity as the issue for selection, then it was illegal. But if diversity training had as a larger goal to enhance that diversity would improve the company, or in this case, the law school. If diversity in and of itself would improve the law school, then it was legal. Okay? And so we find that this is now a $10 billion a year industry. We clearly want to, increase awareness about diversity issues, reduce biases and stereotyping that can, interfere with management in all of its forms, change behavior, manage a diverse workforce. We find that diversity has value. It does. Having a variety of opinions, diverse opinions, okay? And so if you have 10 people in your organization and they're all white male, 50, chances are they're gonna approach problems in exactly the same way. All right. And so all of a sudden, even though you have 10 different people giving an opinion, you basically just have one. Okay. What's the point of having 10? And so instead of perhaps training for diversity, you can talk about creating a culture of diversity, one in which you embrace the idea that multiple perspectives are valuable. Okay? It's not always an easy thing to do, though. People are somewhat adverse to this. In fact, research on organizational diversity has been quite mixed. In one study of 150,000 federal employees, racial diversity was in fact negatively related to organizational performance. But if you take a subset of those organizations where diversity, there was an actual management plan for diversity, then diversity had a positive effect. Okay? So in and of itself, diversity doesn't seem to help performance, but if managed properly, diversity increases performance. So important to move to the future. Okay, so you've done your training, and now you want to talk about, did it work? Is it any good? Okay, have I in fact done something worthwhile? And so there's really 4 different types of criterion which are used for evaluating training. Reaction, learning, behavioral, and results criterion. Reaction criterion is basically the attitudes of the trainee. Learning criterion is how much did they learn. Behavioral criterion is, are there changes that take place on the job? And results criterion are the ultimate value of training to the company. So what we find is that, unfortunately, most evaluation tends to focus on these, quote, internal criteria, the reactions and the learnings. They're called internal because they happen during the training. And if anybody's ever had to do any corporate training, it's almost inevitable that you're going to get some kind of a feedback survey at the end of that training. And though feedback surveys literally will focus on reactions and learning, okay? But yet organizations really should look at those external criteria, which is of course behavioral and results, because those are the ones that are going to make you money. It's not what did an employee learn during training and what did they feel at the end of training, but did it change their behavior? But clearly, the internal criteria are much easier to measure, right? So, hey, you, I found you. No, where did I miss it? Hold on. No, I thought so. Okay. A newer approach is to categorize learning into 3 ways, okay? You can have the immediate post-training knowledge measure, which would be that internal measure, but then do a follow-up with knowledge retention. So if training improves knowledge at the end of training, that's wonderful, but if they don't remember it a month later, there's no point. And then 3rd category should really be the behavioral skill demonstration measures, okay? Oh, where is it? Yeah, I love it, okay. And so how do you test this? How do you evaluate training? What do you use? And so usually you use a quasi-experiment. That is by far the most common. And we sort of briefly mentioned it, so I'll have to remind you. Remember, a quasi-experiment looks like an experiment, smells like an experiment, but it's not an experiment. In a quasi-experiment, you cannot randomly assign participants to groups, okay? Remember we had said, I want to test whether males and females have different job performance. And it's like I have an independent variable with 2 levels, male and female, and a dependent variable, job performance. Yeah, but you don't have an independent variable because you cannot randomly assign somebody to be a male, right? And so if you recall, that word random assignment was that thing that's just critical for a true experiment. So in this quasi-experiment, the most common thing to use is a pre-post design, where you're going to measure people's job performance before the training and after the training. And was there a change? Okay? Or you'll use a pre-test, post-test design where you use a control group of employees that do not receive training. And then the Solomon 4-group design is the best in this scenario. But what it is it's kind of impractical. It involves multiple experimental groups, multiple control groups. It's much, much more expensive and difficult to implement, and therefore most of the time the best you can hope for is a pre-test, post-test with a control group, which is not a terrible design for this situation. All right, we're all done with that, and I think our next topic is going to be on motivation. All right, so we'll see if I'm motivated to get that done today or get that done tomorrow.